Good morning. Thank you for coming here in spite of a very difficult traffic which I just experienced, and I was almost doubtful whether I'll make it at 9:30. I'm going to take 16 minutes, and it's a bit of a tough subject, but I hope I'll make some sense to you, and this book will be of interest to you. Biology and philosophy are the two disciplines that raise fundamental yet provoking questions about human life. In the recent times, the central question that these disciplines ask are centered on the notion and experience of the self of the person. Brain and self are the two phenomena that today everyone, from the common person to the scholar, is looking at to unravel the puzzle of consciousness. The belief is that somehow consciousness is connected with the self of the person. Friends, it's our experience that brings to us the joys and woes to our waking, dreaming, and deep sleep states. It's also our dear self that is prone to the delicate functioning of the brain that directs the conscious states that you and I experience, and also the possibility of going into unconscious states due to neural dysfunctions. In all this, the center point is the experience, along with the experiencer, and it is the most intimate beholder of experience, the experiencer, that responds to the planes of being conscious, and perhaps, we don't know, also to the states of unconsciousness. While an important correlate of consciousness that all disciplines and all people are interested in awareness and different degrees of it, there are other aspects that connect consciousness and the self in finer ways. The character of the person, his or her ability to exercise choice making, free will, and take responsibility of the acts and its consequences, take us to the realm of well-being and how it is connected to the being of the person. The fundamental values that humans cherish, such as truth, love, and beauty, are tied up with the deeper realms of our core self, which are not amenable to reductionist filtering. However much theories of cognitive mechanisms we develop to explain the finer tastes and dispositions of the human, it's interesting that these very graces stay in hiding when their causes and origins are explored. There is a cognitive closure that is confronted, particularly when we discuss complex potentialities of the human self, such as eudaimonia, common good, and altruism. While the term consciousness projects an immediate agnostic unknowability and mystery around it, gone are those days when the discussions were limited to metaphysical and literary imaginations. The comeback of medicine and neuropsychiatry to understand the secret dispositions of the human mind and to travel the paths that the human self ventures has helped to commence the new revolution in the human sciences after the forces of psychoanalysis and Darwinian evolutionary theory. It was not too distant in the past that human experience and the subjectivity of the person were anathema for empirical sciences. The key words that ruled a biologist's imagination were all inspired by the functional roles played by genetics and the physiology of the body until the recent past. Such a stance was confronted a few decades back, and the qualitative attributes of experience and the personhood were brought into the lab to search for possible empirical convertibles and biological correlates. In this trend that is ongoing, the first and foremost entrant is cognitive sciences. Cognitive sciences starts with the agenda of explaining the act of seeing in vision and such perceptual endowments that humans and animals possess. It was soon found that it is crucial to understand the intelligence behind the act of perceptions to justify the variations and differences in capabilities that individuals exhibit while interacting with the environment. Thus, mind came into the forefront through the back door once again from the exclusive grips of philosophy and psychology. Along with the mind came in the new avatar of the body, which is not completely biological but partly conceptual and representative. Theories of embodiment available today in plenty in the discourse on mind and cognitive abilities have refashioned the ways in which the good old body that classical biology was familiar with. The concept of the body in cognitive sciences is an extremely fascinating subject that extended from the blood and flesh of the anatomical body to objects that we desire and possess, capabilities that we can afford, and most importantly to the self that inhere the body, which means the difference and the distance between the traditional ideas about the body and the body dweller is dwindling. The body is the subject of the living person. What is bereft of the body is given embodiment with the powerful structures of phenomenology which endorse experiences that are lived and are alive at all moments. The impact of the body phenomenology on sciences is such that emotions and psychological dispositions, such as compassion, have come to be regarded as significant in explaining the human self and its affective expressions. The affective sciences is today in par with the cognitive sciences to accommodate those tendencies of the human that was once considered to be working against rational behavior and appropriate decision-making procedures. The study of emotions and their place in the geography of the human self have also taken the alliance of the brain, its structures, and neurochemical functions to present viable theories both within and outside the evolutionary context. What does all this mean to that erstwhile philosophical gold mine of the self? Is philosophy sidelined in the pursuit of the undisclosed gravings of the who and the what of the human self? Why have the body and the embodiment become favorites of cognitive sciences to explain human capabilities? By bringing in the body from the dark corners of the pre-Renaissance age to the modern showlight of cognitive sciences and information systems, have we pawned a few physical attributes of the body and added a few non-physical functions onto it? Is the new avatar of the body taking away what is central to the existence of the self? In other words, is the body of the recent times exhuming the self from the ancient times of metaphysics, but only to lead to its extinction? These and many other tributary questions can be approached only if we bring into our focus the role of the interrelations between the brain and the self to chart the paths of consciousness and lead to the unknown and unimagined spaces of the possibilities of the human self. It is no more possible to have exclusivist presentations about the brain and the self if what we look for are the complex ways in which the human self is endowed. Let's begin with one teaser for cognitive neurosciences. Is having a self and being a self two different cases? Many neuroscientists in the recent times have included self as one of the questions science should answer to understand consciousness. But what is the scientific take on the self? Often the self is conceived and conceptualized in the form of the self or yourself or someone else's self. The form myself is hard to be seen in cognitive sciences repertoire. Once we accommodate the notion of self as myself, the detached and impersonal disregard for the self will reduce, and we will start talking about a living self, which is you and me. This is the greatest difficulty faced by sciences such as neuropsychiatry, because there is a lack of involved participation. Even the most intimate subject of inquiry, the self, is overlooked, particularly of its influence on every single person, even the person who is engaged in scientific inquiry. If at all such an intimate self is recognized, with no time spared, it is dismissed as fleeting, promiscuous self who is the illegitimate child of social linguistics or the information processing systems that is embedded in our brains. The immediate availability of the bodily self takes the center stage of one's reflection to acquire closeness to one's identity. The body that inhabits the changing self becomes the self of the person. Let us examine this predicament a bit further. The physical body is governed by the principles of chemistry and biology. But when I and my body interact with the environment, the outside world of people, relations, and objects, I am not worried or even thinking, unless I am a hypochondriac, how the chemical processes are being executed in the body. What I think about are my feelings and thoughts that are directed from and 2, objects, people, and relations. The physiology and anatomy of the body that is anyway concealed to me because of the gift of the human skin is a non-event for me. At the same time, somehow the brain and the body shroud the nitty-gritty of electrochemical processes with a unique, biologically uncharacteristic feeling of I and me. First, I am the one who thinks, feels, and responds. Primarily, it is the thinking person that relates to the body and is aware of the body. Subsequently, the feeling comes that I have a body. There is significant difference between the implications of a being self and a having self. The discussions on consciousness are yet to highlight this distinction that is basic to our experience. The experiential primacy of the self is closely tied up with our ability to reflect and introspect. While the brain might have a big say in deciding our states of waking, dreaming, conscious and unconscious states, it is the experiential self that has the capability to dive deeper and reflect in complex and focused manners. Why this book? I have a few reasons. How do we approach the self and the body in ways which there is more sophistication in our methods and better depth in our conceptualizations? The ways in which we fashion the idea of the self is certainly going to alter the ways in which consciousness is going to be presented to us. This book raises a multitude of fundamental questions that connect human expressions, scientifically termed behavior, with the body and the self. A critical appraisal is engaged in to understand some of the mainstream thinking in neuroscience and neuropsychology on the ideas of the body, experience, and consciousness. What is expected is to encourage an open-minded thinking pattern to develop basic concepts in conceiving the exteriority of the self and interiority of the body in the light of the studies on the subjective nature of consciousness. Some of the guiding questions that will engage us in this discussion are: what is the body? Is it interior, exterior, or both? What is self? Is it interior, exterior, or both? What are the body sense and the self sense? How is the body different from the self? Why is it important to distinguish the body from the self? Does experience belong to the body or the self? What is the body sense constituted of? What is the self sense constituted of? To which sense does experience belong? What is experience? Who owns it? Who is the agent? Is there a minimal self? Is the minimal self sufficiently deep to retain the uniquely distinct human capabilities to reflect and introspect? Is there an extended self? Is the extended self a fiction that is created by narratives that are knitted according to our capabilities to imagine and confabulate? Is the self a bland entity without any flavor, or is it rich with feelings, emotions, perspectives, free will, and purpose orientation? What is the relation between being and well-being of the self? Are we mechanistic entities who have behaviors and controlled by genetically and environmentally determined factors? Who is a person? Are behaviorism and behavior-oriented approach adequate to represent the human selfhood? Is behavior an outdated expression with a biological overload and less humanistic tone? And most importantly, how does the brain challenge the self and self challenge the brain? How is the conspiracy of experience and the experiencer created by the self-challenged brain and the brain-challenged self? What are the goals for this book? The 9 chapters of this book are devoted to discuss one or more of the questions which I just shared with you. And in all through the discussions, what is attempted is to underline the importance of considering the brain-self interrelations and also separating the fleeting self of the cognitive and social sciences from the core self, which is deeply ontological. The discussion on the brain, the self, and the body is also expected to separate the mixed-up narratives inspired by phenomenology-induced embodiment and ontology-directed aspects of the core self. The first chapter introduces the book to you with a recount of the central issues and debates presented in the book. The second chapter gives a preamble to the duo of the brain and the self. Self is the single unit of information and experience that connects sensations and emotions to consciousness. And brain is the biological organ that is often treated as an agent and director of the body, which guides the working of sensation, emotion, and consciousness. To be conscious is always associated with the availability of the neural apparatus. When on one side the human behavior, attitudes, and emotional capacities are intricately dependent on the neural structures and mechanisms, on the other, these are guided by the experiential self. What is intriguing about the functioning of the brain is that the neural connections are renewed and reconnected with newer experiences and as environment demands. The brain seems to be learning from its environment and at the same time influenced by the initiatives that the self takes. There is a mutual challenge that is offered by the brain and the self. This challenge is to make possible the unity, continuity, and adherence of our sensory and the mental experiences. The central puzzle that has fascinated researchers in consciousness studies is of the subjective nature of consciousness and how it emerges from the brain structures and functions. The hard problem of consciousness asks how discrete, quantitative, objective neural processes that are spread out in the brain connect and combine to give rise to a unitary, qualitative, subjective, personal phenomenon close to all our lives. How does the qualitative input in terms of chemical and electrical signals give rise to a qualitative output whose nature is completely different? Among the positions that approach to solve the puzzle of the heart problem, one is that of the brain-mind identity. According to this position, consciousness and the self can be reduced to synaptic connections. Consciousness is all to do with synaptic organizations in the brain. There is nothing other than the neural process. The neural process is the conscious experience. Another trend in line of the reductive explanation in search for neural is the search for neural correlates of experiences and subjective dispositions. Technically called as the neural correlate of consciousness or NCC approach, this line of search is for the causal connections between the conscious experiences and the neural correlates which are seemingly responsible for the origins of those experiences. The functionalist theory, while questioning the very need of framing consciousness for enabling an experience, make their arguments with the help of what is called as unconscious perceptions. For these theories, consciousness is nothing other than sensations. All perceptions are unconscious and sensations are a variety of actions. For instance, having the sensation of a red visual experience, moving the hand, or calling someone are actions of the same kind. One of the criticisms against this view is that brain does not have qualitative subjectivity and hence brain and the perceptual experience cannot be identical. Friends, experience is the eye of the storm for both brain sciences and philosophies that study the self. In the Western world, the significance of the body in conceptualizing and defining the self, inspired by Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, was initiated into explaining consciousness by Francisco Varela. Embodiment theories are guided by the contention that the physicality of the body is insufficient to contain the non-corporeal elements. Can the concept of the body and the bodily experiences, even if extended beyond physicality, contain the possibilities of non-intentional consciousness is a question to be raised. Two philosophical problems that arise from the analysis of experience are the inherent subject-object divide and the amount of the other in me and amount of me in the other. We might possess an intuitive sense of the other, but it is not easy to have a well-articulated description of oneself. The slippery problem that underlies the first-person nature of consciousness is the entanglement of the body sense and the self sense in it, which also forces to revisit the subject-object divide time and again. It is important to examine both these senses. Are the body sense and the self sense distinct? And if distinct, what demarcates the distinction? Where and how are these senses entangled? What constitutes the basic everyday senses that we possess in a default mode? In this chapter, I also discuss the puzzles surrounding consciousness that will stay for another decade or more. The ongoing discussions that address the unity of consciousness, especially in the field of cognitive sciences, suggest two concepts as significant to understand the binding nature of consciousness. These are intention and agency. Our consciousness is intentional when we desire and when we act. We are agents of our acts, physically and psychologically own them, and also morally responsible. Brain and the self together knit the framework of intention and agency to make events and experiences possible. Such a framework has helped the shift of the scientific focus from a biological organ for consciousness to a situated brain. How does consciousness emerge from the complex biochemical molecules and electrical impulses in the brain? Or is consciousness an emergent product at all? In the third chapter of the book, I present a brief profile of consciousness from both biological and philosophical accounts. The reason for brain to be rated as the most important organ of the body is its incredible complexity, unpredictability, and malleability. What started in the 18th century as phrenological studies, the only known scientific way to understand the brain, neuroscience has today progressed with advancements in brain scanning equipment and brain mapping. Brain is mapped by various ways to charter the content and cause of experiences ranging from deception to compassion. A score of allied disciplines have emerged, such as neuropsychiatry, neuropharmacology, neurotheology, neurophilosophy, etc., and all centered on the physiology of the brain, but extending conceptually from biological to philosophical and psychological concepts and correlates. While charting various pathways, these disciplines overtly ask the question as to who is the owner of consciousness and what are the implications for the self. While now and then theories about the nature and origins of the experiencing self are floated, most of them are debunked because of the lack in philosophical depth. While it is beneficial for the neurosciences to endorse a fleeting self, fictitiously produced somewhere in the warps of the neural networks, such a self do not stand the forces of deeper humanistic concern, such as well-being. It is not easy to dismiss the possibility of a lasting self that is responsible for invoking phenomena such as self-healing and self-transformation. The philosophical question which has ensued post-Cartesian mind-body dualism has embraced a different sort of idealism and empiricism that either dismisses the possibility of a core self or equates neural functions with subjective qualities. Thus, either there is only a fleeting self or the brain itself is the experiencer and agent. The Cartesian distinction of the mind from the body was an offshoot of the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and it was important to highlight mind as an independent source of knowledge and body as a conscious automaton. The 21st century philosophy neuroscience nexus has almost given up the abstract schism but embraced an empirically advantageous reductionist model that is either biologically laden or philosophically extreme. Many attributes of the classical concept of the mind are now transferred to the body and the brain. Embodiment theories, while help to extend the idea of corporeality and exteriority, also falls prey to an extreme physicalization of non-physical entities. And the first in this row is the self. The existence of the self is often identified with the possibility of being a body or embodying another object or an action. Thus, what we have today is a different kind of debate, far from the simple dualism inaugurated by Descartes in the West. This debate can be described as the body-mind and body-self debate. The hard problem that brought to light the unease in suggesting a biological escape for the subjective consciousness bargains for a unitary self. Now, there's a divide between what can be achieved through understanding the physiology and perceptual mechanisms of the brain and finding out how the discrete neuroprocesses bind together to give rise to a neatly unified sense of my experience. Perhaps such a divide is beneficial for reaching conceptual clarity and gaining humility on what the empirical methods of science can attain. The conceptual clarity that is unavoidable for any study on consciousness is the distinction between being conscious and what is responsible for consciousness. The first part is experiential and is marked by the overflow of subjective qualities. The second part is empirical and is designed by sophisticated tools to find out how consciousness emerges or what the causal mechanism behind the origin of subjective experience is. For sure, we can know how experience and knowledge happens with the help of neural pathways charted and biochemical molecules isolated. But to reduce the knower into the known and then say the knower also is biologically produced involves a simplistic but grave category mistake. The knower can never become the known. The existence of the knower is imperative for something to be known. Recent research in neurogenesis has suggested that brain is prone to change at all times and the synaptic activity is modified by new learning. Brain has the ability to transfer, extend and take over functions. The capability of the brain to structurally and functionally reorganize according to the demands put by changes in the environment adds to the philosophical puzzle surrounding consciousness and self-identity. In the fourth chapter, I explore the philosophical riddles and experiential ironies that are presented to us by the non-rigid brain. Along with the enigma of the fluid nature of the brain is another equally difficult phenomenon to understand. And this is, how does the self make sense of the neural changes and create corresponding changes in sensations and personal identity? One of the foundational pillars in cognitive sciences, particularly in theories of social cognition, is what is technically called as theory of mind. Theory of mind is the capability we all possess in varying degrees of imagining and knowing what the other person knows. Our social encounters in daily life work in meaningful, predictive and purposive ways because we operate with the help of the theory of mind, which gives crucial information about the minds of the people we meet and interact with. It's also because of the theory of mind that we are able to distinguish between private mental states and information that is shared or commonly available. What I propose in this chapter, so as to build on the theory of mind, is the fundamental divide of me and the other that we carry with us in our social living. The me and the other is one of the cognitive structures on which are embedded all human acts, desires and intentions. What is the me and the other divide? I have a sense that is physically supported and mentally guided as me, which gives me an immediate recognition of the limits of my personal identity. The me sense is invariably accompanied by what is other than me based on my preferences for inclusion and exclusion of people, objects, and life around. Since it is not solely directed by the limits of the physical body, but is very much influenced by the capability of individual consciousness to include and accept, different people have different degrees of the divide. It is important for us to know the extremities of our me and the other so that there is no collision in psychological and physical interactions. Dysfunctions of the brain and the mind can dangerously alter the me and the other divide, causing havoc to self-perception. What is the me sense? Is it a sense that sprouts from the body or the self? The fifth chapter analyzes the concept of sense itself and the constituents of the body sense and the self sense. The question that is traced is my inner awareness of myself separate from my body? While there are imaginative views about the different existence of the self, such as embodied, minimal, autobiographic, synaptic, fleeting, thin, there is hardly any detailed account of the experiential self, the self that you and I possess and carry with us, or perhaps the self that carries us. There is a mainstream view about the self that it is a grand representation that the mind and the brain together create, and hence the sense of the self is a special kind of feeling. On finer analysis, we find the feeling and representation that is conceptualized relies mostly on the attributes of the body and its corporeality that presides experiences. For this reason, I endeavor a distinction between the body sense and the self sense in this chapter, with the argument that the self sense cannot be clubbed under the category of percepts and sensory fields. In order to understand the nature of our identity with body parts and body as a whole, to recognize the illusoriness and reality of that phantom body part which we own as ours, to relate to the representation of the body and its changing contours, it is required to distinguish between the body sense and the self sense, and also imagine the possibility of a core self which is inclusive and beyond the binary. The body sense that is given to us in an almost default mode is a combination of internal and external sense functions such as pain, balance, thirst, hunger, vision, taste, touch, smell, and hearing. Through the panoply of these senses and the mental structures, we relate with the world exterioceptively and interioceptively. At the same time, our proprioceptive capabilities and the ability to chart our own peripersonal spaces bring the body to bear our action, movement, and interactions in a social world. Our body has the capacity to intuitively know how much space it requires. For instance, to occupy a seat, to maintain a distance that is not too distant and not too near from the person we interact. How does the body know and operate these physiocultural mechanisms seamlessly? A strong theory that responds to this question holds the view that the brain creates topographic maps that are continuously updated with the help of feedback from personal habits and day-to-day encounters. The brain too, with the help of the body maps, give feed forward to the body so as to perform in an optimal manner. In effect, our experiences change the maps in the brain, and with reorganized body maps in the brain, our experiences also get altered. What is even interesting is that the brain maps not only the physical body, but also the space around the body, which houses objects, tools we use, people with whom we interact, and many other socio-cultural expressions. The peripersonal space, which is a subject of neurological interest of recent origins, extends our physical body sense to embody people, objects, and other entities and make a connection to feel and identify with this. How subjectivity in the body sense is inherent in the body sense to a great extent perhaps can be unraveled if we build upon the possibilities of the peripersonal space. The next level of what constitutes the body sense extends the idea of physicality to cognitive structures of action initiation and action identification. Means we are the agent of our actions and we own our actions. Agency and ownership are those features of the body sense which makes it compatible for engaging in action and relating subjectively to its outcomes. Studies in neuropsychiatry tell us that brain lesions and brain dysfunctions can cause major impairment to the sense of agenting and owning actions and body parts. While schizophrenic patients often report of delusory events for which they do not take authorship and ownership, cases of asomatonausea reports that body parts are disowned and neglected. The balance between the body sense and the body absence is delicately marked by the way in which the neural maps and functions are organized in normal conditions and conditions that ensue from brain and psychiatric dysfunctions. Any experience is given an intact manner for the experiencer because of the self-sense. It is because of the self-sense that one is able to move from one experience to another and collate different experiences. It is that sense which helps us to recognize that it is the same person who was in the past moment who continues to be there in the present moment and look forward to the future. We cannot say that the self-sense is a sort of memory or a representation because it is that sense which has to be beyond all other structures of mind in order to illumine as belonging to one integral whole of the person. With the self-sense, we become agents of action, possess intentions, make choices, and find ourselves responsible for the choices we make. Self-sense is an indivisible, continuous, and organic intuitive sense that accompanies our lives without fail. Recent discussions on the self focus on the fleeting and minimal self, as I said earlier. Can we derive a self that is minimal and which can be identified in a machine or in an animal? The minimal self query looks for the very basic, stripped down self. While this project is worthwhile to understand the primary ingredients of the self, it also brings in the impression that the sense of the self is a phenomenon that can be cut into parts of increasing order. If we hold that the self at any time is organic, to talk about the minimal self will have no meaning. Another notion that is prevalent is the narrativistic idea of the self. Self-sense is a story that is continuously made and told to oneself according to this view. Such a self is dependent on language and our ability to tell stories. One of the most provocative concepts of self in the recent times has been that of the ego tunnel of Metzinger, which completely negates the self, saying that it's a myth and therefore non-existence. To argue for the non-existent and shifting sense of the self, several variations of intersensory illusion-based studies are used by Metzinger and others. To equate the self-sense as an emergent of the feedback received by the brain from vision, vestibular, tactile, and proprioceptive capabilities is to limit oneself to just a being who sees and uses the body for sensing location and locomotion. In this chapter, I further explore why the minimalism project in fabricating a primitive self is an insufficient method if what we are interested in the self-sense that comes as an integral whole which is alive and organic at any point of time. I propose the core self as a response to the entanglement of the body sense and the self-sense. With the proposal for the core self in the 6th chapter, I trace the contours of the self in the context of challenges caused to the self-sense in neuropsychiatric disorders and how seeking of meaning and purpose becomes important. Our experiences tell us that the boundaries of the self-sense are flexible, contributing to better or worse experiences. The self at times can be fractured or become fragile. The psychiatrically and neurologically challenged self finds it difficult to sustain oneself and the encounters received from a sociocultural world. The self for some others is the most encompassive and inclusive phenomenon leading to self-actualization. The spiritual self is that which includes everything for some. In the cases of neuropsychiatric challenges, which causes strange self-ascriptions, what strikes us is the self's capacity to make meaning of what is experienced, even when the brain circuitry is severely severed. It is because of the core self that the individual constantly tries to solve dilemmas, even when they are neurally created. This also implies that the more the core self is invoked, the better the chances for self-recovery. In spite of the oddities and differences, in and through experiences, an overall value of the self-sense stays that carries forward the agenda of seeking purpose and thereby achieving meaning in life. It is undeniable that there is a continuity in all our experiences which brings forth the past, present, and future to the same moment. We think using information from the past and expectations about the future. The memories that we form are closely connected and contiguous to our experiences. It is the continuity that is felt as adhering to a single unit of consciousness which we call as myself. Contrary to the Cartesian dictum, I think, therefore I am, in our daily life we first are and therefore able to do many things, mental and physical. Otherwise, all our physical and mental acts will not have a place to adhere and we will be floating around, which will be a big problem for us. The question that arises from the central place that self has in our experiences is, are our capabilities to find meaning and unify and integrate different experiences a function of the brain or the self? What I postulate is that it is the core self, the deeper and complex realm of our being, which is impervious to our methods of knowledge that helps generate meaning. The body image and the limits of the body sense are susceptible for modifications based on alteration in social perceptions, brain structures, and functions. Even while experiencing the shifting contours of the body and the self senses, that entity which perceives, intends, and make decisions, however weird it would be, is primary and is the pre-experiential, pre-conceptual core of the self sense. Where we fail in theorizing the self is when we hold the faulty assumption that the body image itself is the self sense and creates ownership of the body. The concept of ownership that we discuss in the context of the body is primarily engaged to theorize discrete acts that are directed by proprioceptive capabilities. The feeling that my body is owned by me itself is a deeper sense that ensues from the core self, which is present in a covert manner. It's because of a deeper being of the core self that the altered body maps get translated into meaningful or strange experiences, and all of them owned by a singular I am-ness. For this reason, it is essential to distinguish between the self sense and the body sense, and both from the core self. The uniqueness of one's perceptions and experiences are not the result of these being connected to one's body, but because of the underlying core self. My key argument in this chapter is that the core self is the very core of being, from where the body sense and the self sense, me and the other, seems to rise, reside, and disappear. However much we attempt to subjectivize the body and the body sense, these cannot become the core self. The 7th chapter discusses emotions as the effective markers of experience. Emotions carve our personal identities, and without emotions in us, others will find it hard to understand us and communicate with us. The bridge for social interaction is built by emotions which play the role of narrators of physical, mental, and social health for oneself and for others. When from one point of view emotions guide neural mechanisms for physiological and chemical balance, from another viewpoint, emotion enhances self-expression and the presentation of the person. Emotion has been a subject of serious interest in the public lives and intellectual curiosity since the time of Egyptian and Ayurvedic medicine. The study of emotion brings in the role of the brain, the body, and the self, interspersed by the influence of environment, society, art, and one's character. Why and for what outcome does the brain generate emotions? Should we consider emotions as evolutionary vestiges or as those subjective elements of personal significance that enhance experience? How are feelings and emotions different? Are feelings always dependent on sensations? Are there feelings that are not dependent on sensations? Can feelings be considered as discrete cognitive events and understood within the framework of neuroscience? Another pertinent issue that is discussed currently is the ability of emotions to be part of a decision-making process by contributing to the cognitive deciders. And you all have heard of somatic markers. Such a conception of emotion brings to our analysis whether we are only cognitive entities and if we think exclusively as a rational entity. Do emotions influence our cognitive capacities and rational processes? Physical sensations and mental fields are presented in a united manner to the subjective experience. There is a belongingness and owning sense about feelings. One of the ways in which emotions are theorized is with the help of the concepts of qualia and representationalism. What makes an experience unique to the person is defined by its qualia and therefore mostly inaccessible to others. The closest relative to qualia is emotion because of its person-centric nature. For many neuroscientists, the concept of emotion is one of the junctions where brain and personal experience meet. Emotions are pervasive phenomena interconnected with physiological mechanisms and phenomenal meanings in experiences, and gives us the feel factor through anatomical features such as gut feelings and psychological aspects. As unique individuals, we own and express different degrees of emotion, and thus some of us are described as warm person and some others as cold in personality. Often the degree of experience and expression of emotions is decided by the repertoire of capabilities, dispositions such as our beliefs, desires, attention, and sensitivity to nuanced meanings, conceptualization, and visualization. A greater challenge that is faced in theories about representation of emotions is the inadequate inclusion of the role of bodily subjectivity in framing the continuum of self-experience. Philosophers who hold a strong self-representationalist view defines the phenomenal character of an experience as one and the same as its poised, abstract, non-conceptual, intentional content. The content of qualia is non-conceptual and is not neurophysiological, according to the emergent theory. Along with the representation theories, there are also contesting views that emotions do not have definable boundaries in the brain or the body. We can only presume that the feel is a property of subjective experiences which is invoked by the object. While the feel factor is dependent on the object and the personality of its beholder, feel also has universal accompanying features such as ownership and an assuring sense of being related to the experienced world. Without feeling emotions and expressing them, we cannot communicate with ourselves, let alone with others. The delicate nature of emotions aside, without feelings, we cannot accurately assess the inner worlds of others and ourselves, cannot bring in creative and imaginative outpourings and add enrichment to our personalities. The feel factor of emotion is the unavoidable phase of consciousness, whichever way it is conceived theoretically as basic or pluralistically nuanced. Our natural ability to express a variety of feelings and at the same time conceptualize our feelings cognitively into the rational structures of thinking indicates that the self which we possess and cherish is somehow influenced by beliefs, hopes, attitudes, values, etc. We seek our well-being through the acts of choice-making and exercise of free will. In the 8th chapter, I discuss the relation between the being and the well-being of the self and how it is important to invoke the core self to gain meaning and purpose in living. Several mainstream positions in neuroscience support a self that has no abiding existence. The central challenge that the fleeting self or no self theorists have to address is how we account for the character and moral agency of the person. Character cannot be imagined to be belonging to a person with no self or fleeting self. Hence, our moral agency and free will have to be understood as special kind of virtues that cannot be explained adequately with the help of a culture of fleeting behaviors and changing perceptions of the person. The possibility of character to belong to only a self that has been continuous and which feels responsible not only for the initiation of acts but also for the outcomes cannot be ruled out. It is hard to understand how a person with fleeting or no self can be held responsible for intentions, acts, and consequences. Our sense of freedom to make choices without being biased by favorable or unfavorable outcomes indicates that the human mind is not a vacant tablet or that the self is a product of language and changing environment. Character and self are to be seen in a common space of existence if we have to appreciate the human consciousness, if we have to appreciate that human consciousness possesses deeper levels of reflective capability and the ability to relate to an undefined core self at times of challenges to the physical and mental aspects of one's identity. In my 9th and concluding chapter, I explored the final frontiers in understanding consciousness and posed the question whether we can move beyond the brain and the body. The central puzzle that consciousness studies present to us is the existence of the evading agent and the enjoyer in and behind experience. How is the subjective intimacy of the self and experience created by an organ that is directed by neurochemical mechanisms? Neuroscience employs brain imaging techniques, encephalographs, radioactive tracer dyes, clinical diagnostic tests, cognitive and AI experiments to trace the beginning and end of the agent of action and the enjoyer of experience, knowing fully well the possibilities and limits of these methods and methodologies. The central concern of this book is to inquire how the brain and the self conceive their role play and create the conspiracy of experience where the physicality of the brain is lost in the subjectivity of the self. The inevitable situation that scholars of consciousness studies have to concede is the possibility of the self in the brain and brain in the self. Friends, this is not a simple dualism, but an organic dynamism that enables us to go beyond any reductionist theory. We have to begin seeing the brain not just in the vat, and the self, not just in culture, but also discover the potentialities and the possibilities of the core self that transcend these binaries. Core self gives us the possibility to conceptualize a deep organic self that is not influenced by the physical, mental, or social self. Core self is the space of consciousness in its purest and most inclusive form from where one gets the courage and bodily adjustments to transcend the challenged psychosomatic identity through self-healing. I'm hoping that you will be inspired and encouraged perhaps to buy the book or to borrow the book from our library perhaps in a month's time and read it, and you will come back to me with comments and criticisms so that I can write a better book, perhaps not in 1 month as Anindya commented last day, but perhaps in a year or two. Thank you very much. Yes, Anindya.
Yeah, so I have a lot of questions, and I don't know whether we will be able to, I don't want to hog the discussion, so perhaps we can discuss it later as well. And just a few comments that I'll flag. The first is I was a bit concerned about some of the comments that you made, for which I was wondering whether there is some evidence that you have. And just to give an example, couple of examples. First, the brain does not have qualitative subjectivity. Or physicality of the brain is lost in the subjective self. While these are arguments and hypotheses that can be put forward, but I wonder whether there is any evidence that leads you to make these statements. Second, I think I will argue with you that Metzinger's work has not really been properly covered in your talk. I know it's perhaps outside.
You have to read the book.
Yes, but I think he does not discount the self. In fact, he defines what he calls a minimal phenomenal selfhood. So there is a self, but he's trying to look at what is the minimal.
Yeah, I'll just interrupt you there by saying that his subtitle of the book is The Science of the Mind and Myth of the Self. So it's a mythical self, which he argues for.
I don't know whether it's mythical because he does experimental work.
It's okay, we can.
No, let me just finish this for the audience who may not be aware of Metzinger's work, where he's able to project an image of the body and get the individual to identify with that body, which is projected, and not with his own at that point of time. And I think it raises very important questions.
Sure.
The third and the final point that I want to make is that of the evolutionary biology of the mind. And I think there is now a lot of work which looks at animals. And of course, we have methodological problems because we cannot communicate with them. But I think there is now particular work which suggests that they have, if not a symbolic sense of the self, but at least an objective sense of the self, where they are able to even perhaps, and they have actually demonstrated free will. There's a movement of robotic arms brought about by thought in a non-human primate, and a whole range of other sort of blind sight has been generated in monkeys, and a whole range of issues which I think will force us to think of the evolutionary biology rather than constrain it within human consciousness.
Thank you so much, Anindya, and to have Anindya's comments definitely will make me more reflective to look at the arguments which I make. But I would be steadfast on certain core arguments which I make. But I'm definitely ready to learn from you, from the experiments and work you do in animal studies. And you have 3 questions. The first question, to put it short, is what is the evidence that subjectivity emerges from the disappearance of the physicality of? Well, that question itself is a very scientific, reductionist-oriented question. I'm not talking about evidence, or I'm not talking about lack of evidence. I'm only saying that here there is a deeply psychological, experiential problem which we have to address, which I think I explained it a little bit in the talk, but which I do quite extensively in the book, that how does something which is quantitative, discrete, and neural in nature and structure give rise to something which is subjective and qualitative in its expression. So I wouldn't look for evidence, but definitely it will be good, but I don't know whether we will have any evidence because it's a fundamental puzzle. And the only way we can perhaps approach is to perhaps nuance it and say how much of physicality is still left and perhaps how much of subjectivity is there, and maybe the subjectivity is very minimal, as perhaps Metzinger holds. Metzinger is definitely a very good author, and I think I shared with Binoy also, who said who had extensive discussions with him recently. He's a very good writer, very good arguments. But I still have a lot of criticisms on the illusion-based experiments which he details, which I have extensively covered in this book, and definitely we can have more discussion on it. And thirdly, or definitely, I am going to learn much more from you, I think, in our coming years of discussion. So evolutionary biology is definitely going to give us a lot of ideas, insights, and I am very much there to learn from you, Anindya. Yes, Binoy.
One thing I am interested to know how the causal is connected with Cartesian thinking. How the causal, the concept of causal is linked with Cartesian thinking. One thing. Other thing is that you said that causal is splittable, or it can have gradation, like in the case of multiple personality disorder, where the same person can have different sense.
Well, I don't discuss too much on the Cartesian divide of the mind-body puzzle there, but what I wanted to, by using the Cartesian dualism, is to point towards a core self which is different from the body sense and the self sense. So because you may also think perhaps the core self is a self sense, but what I wanted to is to see or question whether there is a possibility of a core self which is neither the body sense or the self sense. And the second question was
whether the core self can be divided.
Whether the core self can, no, I think I answered that. So to me, that's why I think I repeated in this lecture and the book that it is an organic, intuitive sense, and anything which can be organic can be split, but then that will be splitting conceptually and intellectually, but not in the sense of its being. Yes.
I have become very conscious of the self and the brain due to some recent problems I encountered. I want to know whether your book touches upon the pathological aspects of the brain and how it affects consciousness. I met patients with recently Parkinson, Alzheimer, and so on. Can we learn something from that, even though it's a non-normal state for the brain and self, the normal brain and the normal self?
Well, I do have a chapter which is devoted to psychiatric and psychological challenges.
So these are not psychiatric.
Yeah, I'm just completing. Okay. But I have not touched upon Alzheimer's or Parkinson's.
Okay,
but I do devote some space to discuss on memory, the whole idea of memory. Yes.
First of all, Professor Menon, I congratulate you very warmly.
Let me also add my congratulations. Sorry, I asked you a question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
I came to learn something and I'm richly rewarded.
Thank you, sir.
Your statements really, taking back to the times of Bernard Descartes and bringing it to Husserl's time, really reasserts the existence of a self as different from the body, and body as something of a vehicle in which the self operates. This takes us really to the roots of philosophical roots of this country, some creative truths that have been sort of realized by many of the rishis. I would like to ask whether in your arguments in this way, you would like to sort of, first of all, put all the experiences to something of the body which has a brain. Brain and the body, you would like to express. And brain has all the equipment which can be operated with in order to create all the emotions. Now, it's very nice because we see that the small molecule, starting from serotonin to dopamine to acetylcholine to whatever you have, or GABA, whatever you have, they seem to really do the trick because combined with the neuroplasticity, they are able to not only create new emotions and also control them. Fine, but we also define certain things known as subtle. This is to take you from that to the, astonishing hypothesis, whatever it is, to say that, look, can these states which are created be stored, like, for example, in the hippocampus or caudate nucleus, what have you, and finally bring it back in various forms of memory, and make the little child, if it doesn't relate itself to the world as we do, as we grown-ups do, gradually acquire this one and have all the machinery with itself, and the self is not really important. If self is important, and as you say, and which makes me very happy, is to finally say, who is this self? With the question that you asked me initially, and probably did not come out as well at the end. Who is this self? If that be so, are there many selves? If that be so, the consolidated selves, where are they? What do they do? Where do they come? And where is the end of the body and the physical end of the brain? Because somehow all the 30 trillion cells seems to simply stop one day. There's no way to come back. Is that the end of the activity of the self, and where does it go next?
Sir, I think
don't expect an answer, but
I think you nailed me at the crux of the problem. And I have to make a confession here that I myself am equally confused at the end of the book to say what exactly is the self, who is the self. Can I give an answer? I can say that this is not, that is not. And because I realize that whenever I try to get into some notion of a self which is non-reduced, which is organic, at the same time I get into the problem of how should I say, of a dualism, of really having to deal with dualism. So I continuously confront in this book, and I'm continuing to do that, haunted by the forces of both dualism and an inner need or an inner desire to talk about something which is absolute and perhaps which is non-reduced. Thank you. If there are, yes. Microphone? Where's the microphone?
What are the altered states of consciousness?
I'm sorry?
Altered states of consciousness.
Yeah.
Under influence of, say, mescaline. But we understand here. At the dose of a
Yeah, that's one topic actually I don't deal with in this book of psychedelic substances and altered consciousness by not only psychedelic substances, by other means as well. But I am sure it's a fascinating subject to talk about, but I don't deal with that in this book. But perhaps we can talk about it later. Yes, Janaki. Excuse me? I have not touched upon specifically on what you call as vegetative states or coma, but I think it's an interesting problem to think about, and I start to perhaps come near that question by distinguishing the self sense and the body sense, and the both from a core self, which is not completely reduced by the activities or non-active states of the body and the self. Yes, sir. Microphone.
Won't you get a lot of simplicity if you assume that these are two aspects of one and the same? That is the brain, and there is no need to distinguish between self and consciousness. And also brain is part of the body. So again that takes us to body and mind for granted. Therefore, isn't it possible to think of these as two aspects of one reality?
You mean brain and self? Yeah, that's one way of looking at it, but I definitely wanted to bring in more refined conceptualization, because this whole problem becomes clearer when we narrow it down as much as possible, and we reach an extent where there's no more narrowing down is possible. And it is at that point I thought I should postulate a concept called core self, which perhaps can be equated with a refined state of consciousness. Yes, Ambassador. Sorry.
In a single cell amoeba or any animal of that kind, there is an aspect of consciousness which is very simple. It is aware of the acidity or alkalinity of the medium in which it lives. It withdraws its tentacles sideways. In a single cell instrument like the amoeba, are there any studies on the changes in the nucleus or in any other aspect by recent techniques of physical accuracy?
Thank you, Dr. Radhakrishna, for that question, but my simple answer is I'm ignorant in that field. Ambassador.
Thank you. My apologies, first of all. I missed your lecture in such plans, and therefore all these are just out of context. Or I just wondered, in medical science, there is a concept of brain dead persons. Where could that consciousness is what goes, I presume. Body is alive. So,
Yeah, well, these are very deep and very complex questions, I mean, philosophically, psychologically, experientially, existentially, first of all. It's a very deep question. So we cannot have any simple answer towards it, even if we attempt one. I can only say that life is very important, and it is not very easy to dismiss life by qualifying the brain as dead or your heart has stopped. I would think life is much more complex and deeper than that. Yes, Anuradha.
In this, you're talking about the brain and consciousness. So brain that is giving rise to the experience of consciousness. If I've understood the book is tackling with this issue in greater detail. But like in the Indian tradition, we have the greater philosophical understanding that originally there is consciousness and brain is an instrument that consciousness uses to know or to understand the world or to have awareness of the world. And there are people who have practiced this getting in touch with their neighbors or separate probably in a different way. So have you addressed any of those issues of probably trying to see how people who are in samadhi state, let's say, what happens to their brain? That kind of a study are you discussing?
Well, I am very fascinated in that subject, but I will have to disappoint you, Anuradha. This book doesn't have anything much from Indian philosophy. Yes.
My question is in any particular person's decision making, is self and consciousness is playing kind of role, or is any kind of relationship we found out in decision making and the self and consciousness? Like you discussed about some decision making.
Oh yeah, well that was about the somatic markers of Damasio's work. Damasio and others have started a new level of thinking that how emotions play a role in decision-making processes. But if you bring in self, there are several other aspects of self which play a role in decision-making. So we have to also discuss about choice-making, moral agency, and so on. Yes. I don't think there are any more questions.
Will we allow one more question to be asked?
Yeah, maybe since we are not, maybe 5 more minutes.
Since anyway, the book emphasizes or draws forcibly the attention towards the existence of the self. And there was a question whether body, mind on one side and consciousness and the self, if you were to identify them together, can they be so moderate and very consistent in the experiences to mean the same universal consciousness of whatever kind? The difficulty would be one of the experimental things, namely, at least in 1 out of every 5 cases of comatology which are brought to the hospital, there seems to be some near-death experience where people come back to say that they were seeing, they were talking, they were communicating, and were unable to. Does this help in bringing to better focus the existence of a non-body is something which occupies the body and rules that one, and so they cannot do the same thing?
Well, again, you know, as a subject by itself is very fascinating, but I don't know how much of the so-called empirical sciences which look for evidence will consider near-death experiences or OBE, out-of-body experiences, as valid in postulating something other than the body sense. But I think there are, of course, these are very interesting, but I think in life itself gives us many opportunities to see that there could be something perhaps which can be distanced from our bodily interactions, which can be isolated. Yes, Anindya.
Let me just add one line to this. So I think Metzinger's work again actually generates an out-of-body experience through his whole body.
Oh yeah, symbolism.
Yeah, he's.
Generates that.
I mean, illusion-based experiments are now very much discussed, and how our body sense also is very fragile and which can be easily fooled, right? By identifying something which is not actually our body. I think I once again would encourage you to read the book. It's also available as an electronic book if you go to Springer website. Read the book and please get back to me with my comments, with your comments, criticisms, suggestions for how to perhaps write something different or modify my next book. I really thank you for your presence today, because particularly I see how difficult is the traffic in the morning to reach here. So thank you so much once again for being here. Thank you very much.